So, the reboot of Futurama just did its season finale yesterday on Disney+. And overall, I quite enjoyed this new series. It did have its problems, probably just because how the creative team have been out of the loop in doing Futurama for so long that they're probably just trying to get back into the swing of things a bit. But overall, I think it was a decent series, and I'm going to go over each individual episode very briefly and tell you what I thought of them. So, first episode, The Impossible Stream. I don't think this was a great episode to start off the new series with. It did have its moments, and I will admit the way they addressed the series finale of the previous series was very clever. I just don't feel that this was a brilliant episode. It did have its moments, like I said, but yeah. I know it was meant to be a spoof of how they keep getting cancelled and now they've moved on to a streaming platform, and that's understandable and kind of clever, but yeah, I just didn't find it all that funny. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't great. Episode 2, Children of Alessa Bog. This one was a lot better. I understand why they didn't start off with this as the opener, because the first episode did involve mostly everybody, and this one was more focused on Amy and Kif and Leela, but it is still a really good episode. So it actually brings back a plot point that was abandoned way back in Series 4. In the second episode of that series, Kif gets pregnant and gives birth to a bunch of tadpoles, which he says will grow into full, matured, actual amphibiosins, which they actually first use that name in this episode, in 20 years. And it's been roughly 20 years since that episode, so that's very clever. Even though the characters in the show have not aged at all, but that's just the thing that Matt grading shows do. I thought it was clever to bring it back, not only because it was a plot point that was abandoned, but it was a very interesting one, because Kif was pregnant, and obviously he considers the kids his and Amy's, but in reality, they're actually his and Leela's, because Leela was the one who got him pregnant. Long story. And they do actually address the clever element of having the dual parentage element there. Not only that, and also the interesting ways in which Kif's species evolves and just the way it works and everything, which have always been some of the more funny jokes of the series. And it's also a very heartfelt episode as well. Matt grading shows have always had a knack of having very sweet, heartfelt moments, and this is definitely one of them. So yeah, I definitely recommend this episode. Third episode, How the West Was 10100001. This one, people argued was a bit too topical, and I'll get into that in a bit, but I do think it was actually pretty funny. It's more or less a parody of westerns, and I suppose on the outside it's a bit of a parody of Westworld, but it's also spoofing the cryptocurrency craze, particularly Bitcoin. And it's pretty funny, the idea of taking this idea of cryptocurrency, which is this new, hot, confusing, and rather Spartan enterprise, and combining it with the old idea of mining in the Old West. It's actually quite clever, and it does lead to some very interesting jokes. It's also got one of my favourite moments of this new series, where Bender sits on a burrow and sings a song about not having an ass, because he had to take it off, again, long story, while sitting on an ass. It sounds dumb, but in that classic Matt Groening way, it's dumb but kind of clever at the same time, but it's just really funny. Episode 4, Parasites Regained. This was also a really good episode. It's basically a spoof of Dune, which, you know, they kind of had to do that considering how popular that's gotten recently, but they have spoofed Dune, both the David Lynch movie and the book series before, so it's not that out of the ordinary for them. And it was a really clever way of parodying it. Basically, Nibbler gets a bunch of stomach worms, which, in a clever way of tying it back to a previous episode, are the same ones from the episode Parasites Lost from Series 3. In order to get rid of the worms, they have to go into his litter box at a microscopic level in order to wipe them out themselves. And like I said, it becomes a parody of Dune, with his sandbox basically being the desert and all the various creatures they come across that live in it being the various civilizations that exist in the Dune world. It was very clever and very funny. I really enjoyed it. Episode 5, Related to Items You Viewed. This one's more or less a spoof of over-commercialism and mega corporations, and specifically Amazon. It was okay. It was not one of the better episodes, but I felt that it had some interesting things to say, and it had a few decent jokes, but yeah, it wasn't one of the better jokes in my opinion, and yeah, more or less a mediocre episode. Nothing bad, but it wasn't that brilliant. Episode 6, I Know What You Did Last Xmas. This one, I think, was sadly the low point of the series. Futurama has had trouble making Christmas episodes since the second one, because both their first two Christmas episodes were brilliantly done, and since then they've not really been able to top that. and this one is more or less the same. It's kind of a spoof of murder mysteries with a little bit of Weekend at Bernie's in there, and I don't mind them going dark in Christmas episodes. That's one of the things that makes the previous two ones that were really good really funny, but I don't know, I just found it a little too dark sometimes, and yeah, I didn't find it all that funny. Though the tribute to Coolio at the end was really sweet, and also really convenient that he happened to do something that was really going out on a high note for him, because obviously he didn't know he was going to die, but he did something that was a brilliant tribute to him for his appearances in the show. Number 7, Race Against the Vaccine. Another episode people complained was a bit too topical, and this one, I think I can definitely understand that a bit more. It was a little bit too specific towards the coronavirus vaccine. And to be fair, it was kind of inevitable that they were going to do an episode based around that, but the various references that they do and the kind of way that they try to make allegories between their world and the real world were a bit too obvious. And to be fair, they've done that before in things like Futurama and Simpsons and The Critic, but maybe it's just because that I'm now of the age where I live within the sphere of where they're getting their references from. It makes it feel a bit too obvious. But yeah, I didn't think it was all that clever. Though to be honest, I think the only reason that they did this episode was just so they could do a joke about Omicron Persei 8 in relation to the Omicron variant. I mean, people were doing jokes and memes about that on Facebook and where have you as soon as the Omicron variant came out, so yeah, they kind of had to do that joke, and to be fair, they did it in a funny way, so I'll give them credit there, but yeah, it wasn't one of the better episodes. Number 8, Zap Gets Cancelled. This was an episode that I thought had some potential, but it kind of squandered it a little bit on execution. So this is kind of like a send up to the idea of modern PC culture and cancel culture, and the idea, are we being too oversensitive, or do we need to go too far with the ways in which we're tackling people who are arseholes? Which I thought was clever, and I feel like it's something that they could address, and I thought they could do it really well. But again, the execution was a little bit muddled. So basically Zap acts even more of a dick than he's ever been in the show before, which, to be fair, considering him, that's quite an achievement. And so naturally he gets put up on a seminar about this, and he gets cancelled, and he has to undergo some sort of ethical training in order to become a better captain. It sounds like a good idea, and I think it was warranted, because I think since modern times a lot of people have been making comparisons between Zap Brannigan and Donald Trump, and admittedly, watching episodes of Zap Brannigan does make it a bit more difficult to watch now knowing that comparison. So the idea of Zap finally getting some sort of comeuppance for his actions, it was, I think, very warranted, because Zap's still one of those characters that you love to hate, but after a while you do start to get a bit frustrated that he never ever gets any sort of comeuppance for his actions. So I feel this was a good episode to go with, but at the same time, it does make it a bit confused, because at the same time Leela gets taken over his job as a captain, and the idea is that she goes to a world where she has to grope aliens in order to do some sort of deal that the dupe wants to do for their world. And I get where they're going for, that sometimes in certain situations that ways in which you act which would be conceived as improper can sometimes be needed, but I don't know, it feels kind of like they're trying to have their cake and eat it at the same time, where they're trying to mock and belittle Zap for being a dickhead, but at the same time see him as a hero for doing the thing that was needed to be done in the first place. Like I said, it's not necessarily a bad episode, and there are some clever things that they mention. I just don't think it quite managed to get the whole idea of what it wanted to say down very well. Number 9, The Prince and the Product. This was one of the episodes that was considered to be one of the worst in the series, if not the worst. But personally, I actually really enjoyed it. It's basically meant to be their anthology episode of the series, like they've done in previous series, like the Anthology of Interest episodes, and the Saturday morning cartoon spoofs such as that. And those have always been some of my favourite episodes, and this one is very much in the same vein, and I thought it was pretty funny. Admittedly, the framing device they used for this one was not a very good one, because you get very distracted because they're putting a bit too much emphasis on the story going in between the various individual mini-stories, and it becomes very annoying. It's sort of like, well, just focus on one story and stick with it, okay? At least with the previous anthology episodes, when they had a framing device, it was very minor and you understood when a story started and why it started. This one, it feels like the stories just come out of nowhere and it is very annoying. But that being said, the individual stories are still very funny and I think they were done very well. It's not a great episode and it's a very messy episode, like I said, but I think it's a little bit harshly judged on, in my opinion. And finally, episode 10, All the Way Down. This was a really good series finale, and it felt like it was a return to the writing that Futurama had in its glory days. So maybe it might have been better if they had this as the series opener and maybe switched the other two around. But either way, it was a really good episode to end on. Basically, the professor creates a simulation of the entire universe, and it goes into that whole, are we a simulation? Are they aware they're in a simulation? And all those kinds of things. And we've seen this done to death before, but they do it very well here, and I like how this episode almost entirely takes place within Planet Express HQ, so it's kind of like a bottle episode in a way, but it's done really well. Overall, this series was very hit and miss, but like I said, considering that they've not been making Futurama episodes for such a long time, I think they did it pretty well. There were a few issues throughout the whole series, of course, the main one being the voice actors are getting pretty old at this point, and sadly it does show. Particularly with Billy West, who you can really tell his voice is starting to go. He doesn't sound as bad as Julie Kavner does when doing Marge Simpson, but he is starting to get there, and in some of the voices like Zoidberg, it's not as noticeable, and for the Professor it actually fits, but with Fry and Zap Brannigan, it does kind of make it feel like they were shoved on without having a drink after they woke up in the morning. It does sound a bit awkward. There's also the topical element of the show, which, to be fair, Matt Groening shows have always had topical elements about them, but you have noticed in The Simpsons, in some of the more recent episodes, if you watch them, that they're starting to get a little bit too topical, or they're picking rather irrelevant references. Again, I think that might come down to how we now exist within the sphere of where they're getting the references from. So when you see the older references from the older shows and you actually get them, it's like, oh, that's kind of funny because you're seeing something that you weren't a part of, and it's just funny to see them reference it in a funny way. But at the same time, I do feel that Matt Groening shows, particularly this series of Futurama, have been taking some influence from Rick and Morty, which, yeah, I don't think that was the best idea. Not saying that I don't like Rick and Morty, at least not the earlier seasons anyway. I haven't checked out the new series, at least I won't be anyway, it hasn't come out yet, so I think I'm pretty much done with Rick and Morty. But when it was good, it was a really good show. And to be fair, it does have similarities to The Simpsons and some of other Matt Groening shows, but yeah, it definitely is its own thing. And the way they're being super topical and trying to be super, super smart and super dumb at the same time, it does kind of feel like they're trying to be Rick and Morty, and that's not something they should do. They should try and stick to being their own thing, which I know is difficult to do after like 30 years, but still, it's better to be your own thing than trying to copy somebody else. At the very least, after you've become established, that is. There's also the element of how now the ethnic characters are also voiced by people who match the ethnicity of the character that they're voicing, which I won't get too deep into that because I know it's still a controversial issue, but me personally, I've always felt that so long as they do the voice right, it shouldn't matter what sort of race or ethnicity or sort of orientation they are. As long as they do it well, just let them do it. So now Billy West is no longer the voice of Amy's father, and also John DiMaggio is no longer the voice of Barbados Slim, though to be fair, Kevin Michael Richardson does do a very good impression of him, so I'm okay with that. But yeah, that's more my own personal issue, and if they want to stick with doing it, fine. It's only the more minor characters that have this done to them anyway. But still, I always found it a little bit annoying. Regardless of that, I did enjoy this new series, and I'm hoping they do some more because I feel that there is room to improve on, and I think that if they keep doing it, then they may actually end up doing that. But I will admit, it was nowhere near as good they were during their prime, or even some of the better episodes of the more recent series that they did, like past Series 5. Even then, it wasn't quite on that par, but still, I think it was a good start, and I think I'd like to see where it goes in the future. But now, let's see what I end up delivering next time.